We're no longer talking about abstract, far-off implications of some of these impacts. It's happening today and right now. Businesses, people are dealing with those impacts. So important to make sure that our messages and the communications matter, not to select audiences, but to everyone.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Hello, I'm Melissa Fifield, head of the BMO Climate Institute. And today I'm joined by my colleague, John Uhren, Managing Director of Sustainable Finance at BMO Capital Markets. John and I were fortunate to spend some time recently with business and NGO leaders, investors, other experts in New York for Climate Week. Today, we're going to be discussing our takeaways from a really action-packed and insightful week, and also looking ahead to how important developments such as sustainable business, the use of AI to support climate solutions, and the growth of carbon markets might evolve. John, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. It's great to be here.
So to kick us off on maybe a lighter note, one of the things that struck me about Climate Week this year was really the optimism. This is really a time when many of the federal government incentives that were maybe available a year ago are no longer there. Did you find the same thing, and what's driving that optimism?
Yeah, I think I found that, Melissa, to an extent, but I might characterize it more as cautious optimism, right? So the fact of the matter was there's over 1,000 events. There's over 100,000 attendees to Climate Week this year. I understand they're both records. Things are ticking along in a number of jurisdictions, like Europe, for example. They're scaling renewables significantly. In China, they're adding record solar and storage. In Canada, have announced transition frameworks and transition bond programs to the sum of $10 billion a year starting in 2027. So there's a lot of cautious optimism around what's happening in many jurisdictions. Then there's, of course, the US, where there's obviously, if you were just to read the headlines, you might believe that things don't appear as though they're ticking along, or certainly they're stagnating a little bit on the sustainability front. And I think that's where the cautious optimism comes. Certainly the folks, the evangelists on the ground during New York Climate Week are really focused on solutions. They're focused on making the right types of investments and mobilizing capital in a way that will have the most impact. But they're also eyes wide open around some of the risks and some of the headwinds that exist in the sector. So it's a really interesting time to be in this space.
I think that's a really important nuance that you've shared there. And I think that we've seen a pivot in terms of talking about maybe some of the having more precision in our language about the business value of some of these things, as opposed to maybe just sustainability or just climate value. And to that end, you're talking to clients all of the time. How are you seeing businesses considering, I'm using air quotes, sustainability in their operations? Are they seeing that as a burden, some type of compliance exercise, maybe a requirement, or are they seeing it as an opportunity?
Well, let me tackle the compliance exercise first, the middle of the three options. It's not that right now. So as I'm speaking to business leaders, they're not thinking of it from a sort of mandatory compliance perspective, which then looks at, well, is it a burden or is it an opportunity? And the truth is somewhere in the middle, but I would say it leans a little bit more to opportunity, in the sense that, a phrase I heard a lot throughout New York Climate Week was around climate pragmatism, right? Being eyes wide open around what needs to happen for sustainability to be properly characterized and prioritized by different businesses. And what there is, and this is where opportunity comes in, a real flight to commercial impact, right? There's a shift to energy efficiency, right? For all sectors, this makes sense, and perhaps this should have always been the focus. But, there's certain sectors, things like utilities, for example, where, the cost of solar is cheaper than, non-renewable alternatives. There's different manufactured technologies like wind or batteries or EVs or heat pumps that are really, all told, producing cheaper forms of energy. And you have things like electrotech or electrification that's really using the same energy services much more efficiently than traditional energy sources. And so when you focus on the pragmatic part, so the efficiency gains of looking at things like EV drivetrains over combustion engines, for example, or heat pumps over boilers, like these all make commercial sense for a business. And hence, as we're talking to clients, we're still positioning the opportunities around the commercial lens and saying, this is something that's good for your bottom line in addition to some of your sustainability objectives. There is a lot of conviction, as you would imagine, at the board level, at the C-suite of the businesses we're talking to, around the need to invest in commercial opportunities in electrification, keep driving efficiencies in a way that's good for the business. There are certain sectors, though, and like agriculture and food production comes to mind, where notwithstanding some of the efficiencies and improvements that a lot of the producers are making across their operations, at the end of the day, we aren't seeing the shift we might have expected all the way down to the end customer, the retail customer, around paying up for labeled products that are sustainably labeled, that have priced in effectively accordingly the cost of becoming more sustainable or reducing the environmental or climate impact. We haven't necessarily seen the end customer demand those in the same way as I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we might have expected seeing. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. I think as we start to see more retail demand in particular for, I use the ag and food sector specifically, but for other products as well, EVs would fall in this, a lot of different, end products, then we'll start to see, companies quickly following as well, because there's the conviction at the C-suite. It just becomes a question of then mobilizing the capital necessary towards that and seeing it pay off and pay dividends in the form of increased demand for product.
One of the things that I took away from some of the conversations that we had at Climate Week in New York was the role that the voice of the customer plays in how a lot of companies, especially hyperscalers, that voice of the customer is really driving the actions that they're taking. We've seen similar findings in our annual business leaders survey, which is it's not necessarily regulatory expectations or compliance expectations relating to the actions that companies are taking, but really the expectations of their core customers that are asking for, demanding, encouraging action related to power consumption and having goals and targets and really being as efficient as possible with those resources. So would you say that maybe momentum for some of these market-based, these pragmatic solutions is flatlining, lessened, growing? What do you think some of the factors that might increase the momentum in the coming years?
I mean, by all accounts, there's still a ton of investment interest in these themes and sort of global sustainable energy type themes, like to the tune of north of $3 trillion. I think in 2025, we're going to see an investment into different green technologies. I think it's like almost $500 billion in solar investment alone. So I think what will really catalyze the space is government needs to be at the table, regulators need to be at the table around ensuring that the right parameters are set up to allow companies to, have the confidence that infrastructure type investments they're making today will still, pay dividends like long into the future. I think in Canada, for example, having a prime minister who's very focused on climate and has a track record to prove that out, I think that's given a little bit more certainty anyway to a lot of corporates in this jurisdiction around the fact that, yes, there's a lot under the prime minister's purview right now in the first sort of 6 months of his term, but we know sustainability will be critical to his agenda and the way that he positions the opportunities for Canadian businesses going forward. I mean, ultimately, capital markets will really govern what is most successful and pick the winners and losers across all energy themes, for example. And we're seeing that in electricity markets already, where you're seeing a bit of a repricing of power in the US, pick on Texas for a moment, but we've seen rapid growth in grid scale batteries that has really, doubled the average of available storage in the past few years. That's allowed them, particularly with some of the peak heat and peak prices that they see in Texas, that's allowed them to drive wholesale prices down quite significantly over the past 2 years.
So maybe that's a good segue. I want to turn to carbon markets specifically. We've heard a lot of interest from our clients, particularly to hear about carbon dioxide removals. What do you see as the main challenges of accessing that market? And do you see improvements in the coming year, or is it a longer time horizon?
The carbon markets are interesting. So obviously there have been a lot of growth and a lot of projected growth for a number of years, call it early 2020 on. That coincided in many ways with a lot of different corporates making voluntary commitments to reach, net zero by 2040, 2050, et cetera. But it was these voluntary commitments that really drove the industry and the carbon markets writ large, because it became, an option where if operationally they couldn't reduce any further, then the carbon markets were there to help them get that last mile around offsetting their emissions. What we have seen is a slowdown in a lot of those voluntary commitments. In some cases, they've been, walked back or removed entirely. So that has impacted, the voluntary carbon market. It has impacted the growth of the market and the projected growth. There is a question, especially around CDR, around fungibility, right? And not all credits are equal, and it's not even close in terms of the types of credits, the quality of the credits, the actual tonnage removed, et cetera. And it is really interesting to see the different valuations of these credits. And I think as you're sitting down and having a conversation with, a finance function within an organization to try and walk them through the menu of available credits, these can range from, $10 to $2,000 per ton, for example. And so I think that the fungibility of the credits, the correct attribution of value associated with the credit and the underlying technology or underlying removal, I think that's going to be really relevant. We also heard a lot about throughout New York Climate Week around the fact that there's just too many registries that exist. It sounds like there's room for consolidation. It sounds like there would be greater access for the market and greater access for market participants if there were one or two or three registries that were really looked to as the ones that were the leading standards, that everyone could go apples to apples and compare the CDRs that are registered.
I'm wondering if maybe you can shed some light and share a bit of context in terms of who are the major buyers in this CDR market. And based on the conversations that you're having, in your view, what would incentivize maybe more private sector investment in the market?
Microsoft is by far and away the largest buyer, certainly of CDR credits. There's been a number of large offtake agreements that Microsoft has entered into that has been really sort of market shaping and market forming. One very recently with Chestnut Carbon for a 25-year offtake. Those types of sort of long-term purchase agreements are critical for this space, right? So Microsoft's doing a wonderful job. There's obviously some other buyers as well, like Frontier and even JP Morgan, that are very active in this space and are sort of propping up the market early on. But I think if we're going to get to a place where you start to see, scalability of this credit market, you're going to have more players at the table. But just broadly and generally, I talked about a lot of registries. There's a lot of developers as well, various stages. And I think there will be a flight to quality on the developer side as well, where the ones that are, most impactful and most effective in creating the most credible and permanent credits will be the ones that ultimately succeed in this market. And the more we can sort of prop up their project programs, the more we're going to be able to start to see just, again, more sort of mobility in the market and the opportunity to grow it in a way that will really align with what we would hope to see for the CDR market.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit, AI was a topic that came up a lot throughout the week. It's the topic that everyone's talking about. I think there's a lot of folks that are super excited about the promise that AI has in terms of enhancing climate solutions or advancing solutions, and, concern about the resources, power, water, et cetera, that is required not only to build the physical infrastructure, but also to maintain the power necessary to fuel its growth. I'm curious, your own perspective based on your conversations and what you heard from folks on the ground. Did you come away more excited about the promise or perhaps more concerned about some of the impacts that we'll see related to AI?
Excited, concerned, and then is confused. Hopefully one of the options, Melissa, as well, because I have to admit there's such opportunity with AI and across sustainability, yes, just broadly across the way that we live our lives on a daily basis. But I will say that AI and data centers empowering AI, this theme came up in virtually every conversation that I had throughout New York Climate Week, with people really focused on, the opportunity for it to materially change the way that we approach climate change and have some of the technological advancements that we've been hoping and praying for. So when I think about AI, like it's obviously there's data that can be provided through AI, which will be critical for, different purchases of power to really understand what the impact of the power they're producing is and the sustainability implications of the power and its sourcing. There's going to be ways for consumers to, pick and understand the fruits and vegetables that they're eating and buying in a way that they never have previously, because there'll be tracking of data, even all the way from the farmer's field, all the way through to, to their table around the environmental footprint of the food they're eating. Same thing in the clothing space, the food and clothing space, which you're very familiar with. It becomes really interesting when you're thinking about traceability and thinking about sourcing of sustainable commodities and going beyond simply understanding what, labels on clothing or companies, they attach to their operations. You can use AI to really get data in a way that we haven't seen in history. I do find it interesting, though, and this is maybe where confusion comes in a little bit, because there's obviously a lot that can be done with AI, but the moment you bring up the power or the water associated with data centers, they kind of stop you in their tracks and say, well, you know what, it's bad for the environment because it's going to use too much power, it's going to use too much water. We don't have an effective way of regulating that, and we're already pretty energy constrained. So I think throughout all of this, the theme that I sort of came away with was there's a balancing of all of the needs, right? And including with AI, if it's actually used to do things like traceability, to understand the flow of inputs that go into your clothing, et cetera, I think that's a really interesting and compelling use. I think the data center question and the powering of data centers, like that is obviously very front of mind in the sustainability space. And we look to, different technologies, different, developments and inputs like nuclear as an example as being part of the solution. So I'm excited by it. I don't purport to understand it, nearly well enough, but I also am intrigued by the environmental impact and the ways that, we at BMO and others can really be focusing on sort of mitigating some of the biggest impacts you'll see associated with data centers.
Absolutely. I mean, I think similar to the comment you made earlier about infrastructure needs and the need to have government and regulators at the table. So too, as it relates to AI going forward, these have gigantic implications for our communities, our power needs, our access to water. So we need to have a thoughtful approach. COP30 is right around the corner. What outcomes are you expecting this year? And in your view, what would make a successful COP30?
Well, I'm hopeful for action, just generally, right? And maybe this is my takeaway for every COP or every sort of global gathering is you want to see something that goes beyond just messaging around the things that need to happen. And certainly that's part of it, around setting like nationally determined contribution levels by country. That is going to be part of the story that comes out of COP30, I suspect, is looking at these NDCs, looking at the role that we all play as global sovereigns and then consumers within nations around climate change. And if I'm a regular consumer, which I am, and I'm looking to leaders at COP30, I want to know that what they're doing is trying to create some form of resilience or adaptation that will prevent or, try and mitigate anyway some of the worst impacts of things like heatflation, because those have real costs in the form of, human health costs, but have costs, as well for governments in terms of healthcare and things like that. And those are things that are fungible or tangible, and I can understand them in a way that I maybe can't understand carbon, being emitted into the air and that making the earth a little bit sick, according to my 4-year-old's book that we read often. And then showing tangible outputs at COP30 and beyond is something that I'm really hoping we see, and I think will really resonate with people, that the layperson who may be on the fence, maybe reading, again, headlines and not sure what to believe about things like climate science. Climate change is here, it's real, and we're seeing it in all of our communities. And I think the more we can start to come up with solutions around how to prevent or at least mitigate some of those worst impacts, I think the better off we'll be.
Absolutely. And I think we've come full circle to where we started, which is a pragmatic focus on the value of some of these activities and some of the efforts to either minimize risk or unlock opportunities for business. But the key is to make it real for people. We're no longer talking about abstract, far off implications of some of these impacts. It's happening today and right now. Businesses, people are dealing with those impacts. So important to make sure that our messages and the communications matter, not to select audiences, but to everyone. Thank you so much for your time today, John. And it was good to see you in New York and really appreciate you sharing your key takeaways. Before we wrap up, anything else to add?
Let's get out there and let's start acting now. Time is of the essence, so let's go.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.